All right, our last and final chapter, chapter 62, EMS Operations Command and Control. Some of you may have had incident command training, and within fire departments and other agencies, the incident command structure is slightly different than the EMS Operations Command and Control, and that's why we have this particular chapter. The whole reason for command and control is just that, to command a scene, take control of a scene that makes the scene safer for everybody that's there. You don't duplicate efforts. And for EMS, that requires us to do things like setting up a triage area, a transport area, a staging area, and having officers in all these different positions. But the other issue with command and control is that sometimes these events can get so large that the span of control, the number of people that you may have reporting to you in your position, is just too many. As a lone EMS provider on a major incident, if you had to report to all the responding ambulance services and keep track of those and all their personnel, plus the initial personnel that responded, plus your additional help you called in for firefighters and the general public, victims themselves that may be able to help. For one person to be in control of all that, that's just too many people. So command and control teaches us to maintain a workable span of control, which is usually no more than 5 to 7 people. So as an individual in charge of a particular part of an incident, I would have no more than 5 or 7 people reporting to me. If I did, then that would be an indicator to expand the incident command structure. Command and control creates a single incident commander, and as we know, the fire chief at the scene of an event out in the community is typically the incident commander, but that doesn't mean we can't have a medical incident commander managing all the EMS services, the fire chief managing the fire services, and law enforcement managing the law enforcement services. There's no way of getting around it. When you're dealing with a large incident, you have to have command and control. You're familiar with the Incident Command System, ICS, and that came about as the result of wildfires. A group called FireScope got together and developed this incident command system so that responding fire departments would all be speaking the same language and they'd all be able to communicate with each other. This later developed into the National Incident Management System, or NIMS. And the terminology varies between systems, and what that means is that certainly the hospital incident command system, the fire service incident command system, the EMS incident command system, they're going to have different terminology but very similar structure. The thing about incident command is that, and NIMS, is that they're both flexible and they're adaptable. So this is a structure that you can use for command and control regardless of the incident. So this works well for terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and even planned events. At the hospital, we've used the incident command system for planned utility outages. We used it for Ragbri when it came through town. So it certainly is helpful for both. We know that incidents increase and decrease in size, and so we have to have a system that's able to expand and contract for what our needs are. The federal government mandated through Homeland Security Presidential Directive Number 5 that local, state, tribal, and federal governments adopt and use the NIMS. And the carrot they put out there to ensure that people are NIMS compliant is you're not able to receive federal funding if you're not NIMS compliant. So that's been kind of a push, because in a disaster, if there were FEMA money available, you would not be eligible for it if you couldn't document that you were NIMS compliant. Again, the whole purpose of NIMS is that it does provide common language and terminology, so that if I'm pulled to another county and stuck into a incident command structure, I understand what those roles are and what I might be doing. When we look at managing a major incident, the terms that emergency managers use frequently are the ability to be able to mitigate an event. And mitigation just means to, take a really bad situation and not make it worse. We can't help if a tornado runs through town, but certainly the way that we handle that, if that has been identified, practiced, and everybody knows what their role is and what their job is and how they would handle that, then the outcomes are better. And that requires us to maintain a state of preparedness. That requires us to plan our response and practice our response, doing emergency preparedness drills. And then there also should be something in the disaster response plan concerning recovery. Now that the event is over, how do we get back to normal? The critical components of a disaster plan is that it should be uniform. There should be a consistent set of rules. It should speak common language, and so that no matter, again, where you go, you know what an incident commander is, you know the responsibility of a safety officer, a liaison officer, you know what an operations section chief is, all those different positions that you might see in this system. It's a common approach where the incident is divided by geography or function, and officers are titled by their area function. Now, there are 4 main officers in the incident command system. You've got your operations section chief. I guess officers would be up top. In the command section of the incident command system, you've got the incident commander, and within his command staff or her command staff, you would have a liaison officer, you would have a public information officer, you would have a safety officer, and then a medical technical specialist. And below that, you would have section chiefs. You'd have an operations section chief, you'd have a logistics section chief, a planning section chief, and a finance section chief. And you can remember the major functional areas of incident command by CFLOP. Command, which would be the command positions, finance, logistics, operations, and planning. And safety actually is up in the command position area rather than by itself. Setting up incident command is not always required, especially if your incident is going to last a short period of time. The vast majority of calls that you're going to go on, there's no need to set up incident command. But if you're dealing with a tornado strike or something like that, where search and rescue efforts may take days, recovery, all those other things, then there needs to be an incident command center set up and roles defined and functions carried out through that. The nice thing about the National Incident Management System is that it's a standard operating procedure. Even though that each agency has its own protocols, their own standard operating guides, their own SOGs, their own SOAPs, this flips us from that system into a system where everybody would relatively function the same way if you were in that role. In other words, an incident commander is an incident commander no matter who assumes that role. The standard operating procedures, the standard language that you see in an incident command structure helps everyone know what their role is. And this is something, again, that should be trained in them before the incident occurs. And that's part of the preparedness in the 4 common practices for disaster management. Being prepared for the type of disaster that you may be likely to experience in your county is important. There are a wide variety of hazards that we face, and in most counties what occurs is the county conducts a hazardous vulnerability assessment and determines what they're most vulnerable to. And in most parts, it might be tornadoes and flooding, maybe a severe winter storm, an explosion, things like that. And then they pick one of those hazards, and they do a critical assessment of, how can we manage this? Do we have everything we need should this occur? And if not, where can we get it? And then they drill it and practice it. And during the drilling and practicing, they identify opportunities for improvement. And to close that loop, they assign an individual or a department or something like that a responsibility to complete a task and a timeline to have it done. And then they re-drill it again with all the changes to see if it meets their needs. And once they're satisfied with that particular process, then they can move on to the next hazard. Pre-planning. We know that large-scale events are quite infrequent, and that's why we have to conduct ongoing training in order to be prepared. Many times during a major incident, you're going to be responding in an area that you're very familiar with. You may know the people, they may be family members, and so the mental health of responders is often overlooked and mismanaged. The physical work that may have to be done over a long period of time may be, again, overlooked and mismanaged. And it's very important that we have diffusing stations for mental health, we have resting stations for rehab, and that we don't, even though during a disaster people will step up and want to work 24 hours straight or 36 hours straight with no sleep, but that's not good for anybody. In addition to the responder can make poor judgments and not function optimally, which could be detrimental. So it's important that we do set up things to address the physical and mental health of the responders. Large-scale events are going to have a profound impact on you as a responder. There's just no doubt about it. I can still remember my first large-scale event, and it wasn't huge by today's standards, and it certainly didn't last long. But for me, as an EMT out of Iowa, being out in the middle of nowhere in Colorado in a deuce and a half with 24 soldiers pulls out onto the interstate and is hit by a fully loaded cement mixer. We've got bodies everywhere, and we still have a very active interstate system. And to top it off, it's midnight, and we didn't know anything back then about incident command or staging or any of those things. So if anything, it was an organized cluster. CFLOPS, I had mentioned that, command, finance, logistics, operations, and planning, and they insist on putting safety down here because safety is such an important part that is often overlooked. The safety officer does have the authority as they move around the event and see the practices that are occurring to stop a practice in its steps if it is unsafe. people trained should know that that's the responsibility of the safety officer, and when they do tell you to stop, they have that full authority. So here's a sort of a diagram of the incident command system. You have the incident commander, and off to the right you have the command staff, the PIO, the safety officer, the liaison officer, the operations section chief, the planning section chief, logistics, and finance. Command is the incident commander, and the incident commander is in charge of the overall operation. All incidents need to have someone in charge. It could be singular command, like I had mentioned, where, you know, if you had a house fire and that was all you were dealing with was a house fire, the fire chief could be a single incident commander, and everybody would report to the fire chief, to include his officers within the fire department and the firefighters, as well as EMS rehab. It could be unified command, where you're dealing with a major incident where you're going to need a firefighter or the fire chief or their designee as the incident commander, and then you could have a law enforcement incident commander, you could have a EMS incident commander, again depending upon the scope of the incident and span of control. The finance section is seldom used, but is important because if you don't have the proper documentation of your expenses, you won't get reimbursed for them. And logistics is responsible for providing you what you need, not only in the area of supplies, but in the area of staff. So if you need additional responders and you need additional people, litter bearers and carriers and patient transporters and buses and whatever else you need, that's the responsibility of the logistics section. The operations, they're the worker bees. They carry out the tactical objectives of the incident commander. They direct all the front-end operations. They participate in planning, and they, because of their participation, may require a modification to the action plan. Every major incident is going to have a plan, and most of us are familiar with Plan A. Plan A is your disaster response plan, your emergency response plan, whatever it is that you call it, that's your Plan A. But what if you get there and the things that you've planned on just don't fit this type of response? Well, that's where you have to quickly develop an action plan, and that's done by the incident commander, or it's done by the planning section and approved by the incident commander. The operations section also has to account for all personnel, where they are, what they're doing, that sort of stuff. The planning is they write the plan. They write Plan B and Plan C. And they also write the plan for demobilization, what to do when we're done, how to get back to normal. And then the safety officer is the sole function is to prevent unsafe actions, and as I had mentioned, would be able to stop any actions that were unsafe. In large incidents, you're going to have a public information officer as part of the command staff, and the PIO will coordinate with other public information officers in an area known as a JIC, a Joint Information Center, and the PIOs are responsible for releasing information to not only the public but to staff, keeping staff aware of the whole big picture situation and what's going on, but also letting the public know. And the importance of a public information officer is that the releases are timely, they're accurate, and they use the press to the best of their abilities, rather than allowing them to shove a microphone and a camera in some responder's face and ask them the whole questions about what's going on. The responses would be very deliberate, timed, it's given out at certain times, that sort of stuff. The liaison officer is, let's say if we had a major event in our county, I happen to be the liaison officer for not only the hospital but for public health, and my responsibility would be to either physically go to the emergency operations center within the county and report information back to the hospital so that they have an idea of what's going on as well. Or as a liaison officer, if I need to reach out to the fire department for services within the hospital during a disaster within the hospital, that liaison officer is responsible for making all those outside contacts. So there's, here's an example of a basic command system where, again, you have the incident commander and the command staff being the PIO, the liaison officer, the safety officer. You got your section chiefs, and below that, planning. You got a technical specialist to help with the plan. Resources situation unit leaders. They're looking at the resources and what do you need, and the situation's looking at the actual event. What do you need? Logistics, you've got a food unit. They're procuring food for those that are part of the event. Operations, you got a staging manager, fire, EMS, and law branch. And below the EMS branch, we're going to have other positions as well. Again, the incident commander is in charge of the overall situation. It is a role, not a person. It requires a quiet, safe workspace, provides visibility of the incident and no workers. Larger incidents, the incident commander may set themselves up in a emergency operations center. The role of the incident commander is to do an initial scene size up. It may be a closed incident in which everything is stable. It may be an open incident in which case everything is unstable, and expanding or likely to expand are decisions that the incident commander will make. Can we manage this with a basic core positions? We may not need finance. We may not need planning if this is going to be a short event. Those sort of things. Also take into account additional patients, additional hazards, and additional damages. The priorities, first and foremost, are life safety. Second becomes incident stability, and third becomes property conservation. And it's important to keep those priorities in mind, because when you look at delegating resources, those areas that have life safety issues are going to get the resources first. Those areas where incident stability is the main issue, they're going to get the resources second, and property conservation are going to get the resources last. The incident commander can request additional help, and that's based on input from the operations folks. We want to avoid excessive radio transmissions, because if you ever participated in a drill, one of the things is either the radios don't work, or if they do, people are on the wrong channels, and then everybody thinks they need to talk. Talking should be limited to, perhaps a transport officer, a staging officer, and a responding service only needs to know where they need to stage. Assign sectors as well for treatment. Triage is conducted through assessment of the scene by the triage officer. We know that triage is going to identify the priority of the patients, categorized by severity. Extrication and rescue is performed first on those triaged as the most severe. And the operations folks, a branch of operations would be, extrication and rescue. You could assign that as a branch of operations, and a branch director would coordinate the extrication and rescue. And there may be a need for specialized equipment, and that's where your logistics folks come in and finding you the equipment that you need. Treatment, that's done by not the triage officer. The triage officer is triaging, and then people are moved from the scene to a triage area where treatment can begin. And the whole purpose of coordinating treatment of patients is to ensure that patients are delivered to the transport area that need to leave the scene first. Transportation is handled by a transport officer. They coordinate the movement of patients to different medical facilities. They track the destination of patients, who went where. They conduct all the radio communication with the receiving facility. Now, your transport officer could also oversee the triage area where patients are brought and treatment is conducted. One of the big mistakes that EMS makes in a major incident is they treat at the scene, and the only real treatment at the scene that needs to occur is control of exsanguinating hemorrhage and opening an obstructed airway. Otherwise, those patients can be escorted back to a triage area where the reds are put in one place, the yellows in another, and the greens in yet another. The blacks are left on scene, and the reds can begin treating first and transporting first. Staging is where everything is going to arrive. When all the apparatus arrive, the additional ambulances, the additional fire trucks, additional staff, they're going to stage in an area not directly at the scene, but some distance away. And a staging officer would respond to receiving services to let them know where to stage. And then would assign them to different parts of the disaster. Rehabilitation manages the rehabilitation area, and this is where workers can be hydrated, nourished, medically monitored, as well as receive some diffusing if they're emotionally upset over the incident. Safety, I mentioned that already. The safety officer is empowered to stop unsafe acts, and they're empowered to institute immediate safety practices. Because remember, life safety is the first priority in an event. Logistics is going to get you the needed equipment, the needed materials, supplies, as well as human resources. Primary triage is used in a large-scale incident. It's going to separate the reds from everybody else. Secondary triage identifies the most critical of the remaining from others, and then determines your order of treatment. So primary triage is, hey, anybody can hear my voice? Go over to the green truck and stand there. Make sure there's somebody over there, otherwise they'll steal your truck and take off. But just have those report. Now those are all your walking wounded, which allows you then to conduct secondary triage to identify the most critical of the remaining, and then that'll help you sort out who gets treated first. We use start triage as our triage scheme. It is a widely accepted triage method across the United States. It quickly differentiates critical patients from others. It looks at how the injury has affected their physiology and not at the injury. So that's kind of nice, because there's so many different types of injuries that a person may have, and it really doesn't matter what the injury is as much as how is it affecting their airway, how is it affecting their breathing, how is it affecting their circulation, and how is it affecting their level of consciousness. Patients are identified by red, yellow, green or black, and most services are using triage tags to tag the patient. And here's an example of a triage tag where the patient could be tagged. Some basic information could be recorded, and this tag would go with the patient to the facility. All right, so that ends our discussion on the very last chapter of the program. I want to thank each and every one of you for the hard work that you've put into this program, first of its kind. I wish you the greatest of success. I know you'll do well. You're an extremely bright group. I've really enjoyed this year, and if you have any questions ever, you know how to get a hold of me. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.